music from the orchestra. Let me give you a background of one of the most interesting cases where an orchestra stood the test of time. On the evening of 15th April 1912, the RMS Titanic slipped beneath the icy waters of the North Atlantic. History remembers the tragedy, but few remember the musicians. As panic spread across the decks, 8 members of the ship's orchestra reportedly continued playing. Can you believe that? No one knows with certainty what the final piece was. Some witnesses believed it was Nearer My God Today. Others remembered something entirely different. In fact, what everyone agreed upon was this: while the ship was falling apart, the orchestra remained united, and each musician played a different instrument, different sounds, different notes, different rhythms, yet none tried to overpower the other. The violin was not jealous of the cello, the piano did not compete with the bass, and each fulfilled its purpose because every musician followed the same conductor. Now imagine this. What would have happened if every musician had decided his instrument was the most important? Even during that tumultuous time, there would have been noise, not music. And perhaps no city in the ancient world understood that tragedy better than Corinth. In our historical discourse and our discussion of the Corinthian church, it appears that the Corinthian church's Christians possessed extraordinary spiritual gifts. But instead of producing harmony, their gifts had become instruments of rivalry. And the problem was never the gifts, it was the hearts holding them. I welcome you to today's episode, Spiritual Gifts. In fact, it is one of the most talked about yet misunderstood topics as far as human endeavor and talent is concerned. There is a straight and a strange paradox in human nature. The very things God gives to us to unite us can actually become the very things we use to divide ourselves. Isn't this fascinatingly true? Knowledge, leadership, talent, influence, even spirituality. Paul now addresses one of the most sensitive issues in the Corinthian church. And that is why it is important for us to carefully consider what Paul really meant when he spoke about spiritual gifts. He tells us in 1 Corinthians 14 verse 1, "Pursue love and earnestly desire the spiritual gifts, especially that you may prophesy." Now, what is Paul really meaning here? In our discourse, we will understand perfectly that it is clear the Corinthian church was very much divided on various issues. They disagreed about preachers, about eating, about marriage, or even more importantly about spiritual gifts and who was supposed to be honored. More interestingly, Paul shows how spiritual gifts go from being a problem to actually being what is supposed to be: unity. But a question that I tend to ask myself is, which gift is the best? Well, quite unfortunately for most of you, none. And the question is, why? That will be the bedrock of our discourse. It is important to understand what really spiritual gifts are. Many gifts and one giver. What does this mean? And how can we have many members with one body? What is really the unifying element? Is it the excellence of love? Or how can we carefully understand how spiritually special some gifts can be? Do you have the gift of tongues? And do you have the gift of prophecy? And how are these really meant to be used? Let us begin on a very good note. Spiritual gifts. You see, Corinth was a deeply religious city. Its temples echoed with ecstatic chants, prophetic utterances, and mysterious spiritual experiences. It is a place where many converts had come from those pagan religions into Christianity. But the question is, in all of this, how did they understand the giver of the spiritual gifts? Because the danger was obvious. How could they distinguish the work of God's Spirit from mere emotional excitement or even counterfeit spirituality? Well, it is something they had to deal with. And that is why, in modern neuroscience, something fascinating is revealed. When an orchestra performs beautifully, scientists observe that the musician's brain activity begins to synchronize. Wow. They are literally becoming coordinated around one musical purpose. So different minds acting with remarkable unity. But who actually, in the context of the Corinthian church, gives these different notes or musical instruments? In other words, different spiritual gifts. Well, according to 1 Corinthians 12, there seems to be differences of gifts, ministries, and workings, but the same Spirit, Lord, and God. Three different explanations or terms used consecutively. And you tend to ask yourself, what does this really explain for us as the giver of those spiritual gifts? You see, according to this particular passage, gifts, ministries, workings, or in other translations, operations all refer to spiritual gifts. To help us understand the relationship between spiritual gifts and their giver, Paul uses these three distinct, however quite related, terms: gifts, ministries, and workings. Then again, he uses Spirit, which is Holy Spirit, Lord, which most definitely is Christ, and God, to refer to the giver, that is to say, the deity working in unison. And of course, that is clarified in John chapter 14, verse 16. So it is the same God working through all. This is no accident. It reflects the very nature of God Himself. But the thing is, God does not bestow gifts as the Greco-Roman gods. God is someone who does not follow that required hierarchical selection of recipients. In other words, God is actually giving the gifts not on condition of hierarchy, but according to how He wants all people to enjoy the gifts. Every gift is entrusted for one purpose: the common good, not personal recognition, not spiritual status, not applause. And it is quite important to note that a gift ceases to function biblically the moment it exists for self-promotion. If you're a musician and all you sing for is self-promotion, then probably you have to think twice of how you are carefully using your spiritual gift. Let me quickly break with a bridge. The International Space Station circles the Earth at nearly 28,000 kilometers per hour. It contains life support systems, navigation systems, communication arrays, laboratories, robotic arms, even solar panels and docking modules. Now, remove one essential system and the entire station becomes vulnerable. No module can boast, "I alone keep everyone alive." The mission depends upon cooperation. And this is what Paul would smile at in his illustrations. The church in essence, is actually designed in the same way. You see, God gives different gifts to different people, and it is for the benefit of the church. The gifts that Paul gives us example of are among the many gifts that exist. And carefully, Paul gives these examples to clearly show that they are severally given for several purposes to ultimately benefit the church. In 1 Corinthians 12, verse 8 through 10, there are gifts such as wisdom, word of knowledge, faith, health, performing of miracles, prophecy, discernment of spirits, tongues, and even interpretation of tongues. In other parts, Romans, for example, we see spiritual gifts concerning service, teaching, exhortation, generosity, leadership, and mercy. Ephesians also adds to this list. The Spirit gives the gift of apostleship, evangelism, and the pastoral service as well. Many gifts, one giver. Now it gets more interesting. How many members, and what are really these members, even in one body? 1 Corinthians 12:12 tells us, just as a body though one has many parts, but all its many parts form one body, so it is with Christ. This actually captures another important metaphor of Paul. God is one, but each member of the Godhead has his own function. Likewise, the church is one, but each component of it has its own function as part of the body of Christ on earth. Wow. The church is a body. You see, it is not an audience, neither is it an organization. It is a living body. So Paul basically uses the analogy of the human body as a church to highlight the unity in diversity. Eyes, hands, feet, ears, heart, each different, each necessary. And you ask yourself, suppose the eye declared, I don't need the hand, or the foot decided, I'm less valuable because I'm not the eye. The body would immediately become dysfunctional. But Paul points something revolutionary. Uniformity could destroy the body just as surely as division does. And that is why God intentionally creates differences. The power of the church does not lie in uniformity, but rather lies in diversity and how that diversification can be united. In fact, the diversity itself is his design, and that everyone should care about the well-being of others. The danger comes when there is comparison. Comparison turns gratitude into jealousy, and it transforms ministry into competition. Comparison forgets that the Creator assigned every function intentionally. Well, there is something even deeper for us to discuss. What then is the unifying element? That brings me to understand the power and the excellence of love. So Paul says, eagerly desire the greater gifts, and yet I will show you the most excellent way. And here we go. You see, love in itself is not a gift. It is even more than that. It is the most excellent way. It is a fruit of the Spirit in the life of a believer. And you tend to understand that spiritual gifts can only be used properly through love. It is no surprise that our world celebrates visibility. Yes, on social media, those who are known are those who are more followed. Those who are known are those who are almost on every platform. Our world celebrates visibility, recognition, and Paul actually celebrates something else. My man Paul, always intelligent in a different way. Of course, he was blessed of God. Paul celebrates an unnoticed servant, and that is, he says, Parts of the body that appear weaker even deserve greater honor. And that really tells me a lot of things about viruses. You see, the most dangerous of diseases in our world today are caused by the minutest of organisms, those we never notice or see by the naked eye. Paul says, the parts of the body, and I repeat, that appear weaker even deserve the greater honor. Well, Paul is not comparing. He is carefully disguising what is important as truth, yet less recognized. The gift of tongue, for example, without love, is a resounding gong or a clambing cymbal. The gift of prophecy, the gift of knowledge, and the gift of faith without love are nothing. And that is what Paul is saying. Without love, whatever that we cherish as a gift, even that which have been given to us, are nothing. So, the mother teaching her children to love Christ, the member who encourages others without ever standing behind the pulpit, heaven measures significance differently from the social media. And many of the church's greatest ministries happen where cameras never go. The human heart receives no applause, yet without it, every visible part dies. Well, let me bring a bridge. Do you know that during the World War II, mathematicians studying damaged aircraft reached an unexpected conclusion? Well, they tell us that the planes that returned showed bullet holes in the wings and fuel cells, or even in their bottoms. At first, engineers wanted to reinforce those damaged areas. Then, statistician Abraham Wald realized the opposite was true. The aircraft that never returned had likely been hit in the places no one could study. Critical systems like engines and cockpits. The most important parts were often the least visible. And Paul understood that principle centuries earlier. And that is why the church survives, because of faithful people whose work are largely unseen. Never think that you are the engine of a church. Probably there's someone doing more, but never is seen nor takes the accolade. Well, it gets more interesting. You see, what does love really do? Love is patient. Love is kind. Love rejoices in truth, even when it comes from others. Love excuses everything. Love believes everything. And that is not to say love trusts even the wrong things. The thing is, love always confirms truth. And by that, love makes everything wait, because the good things come when we wait. Love endures all things, but love does not do these. And this is something I need you to carefully understand. Love is not envious, neither is it boastful, nor is it proud, it's not rude, it's not selfish, it doesn't get angry easily. Anger in itself usually stems from hate or disgust, and love doesn't hold a grudge. More importantly, love does not delight in evil. Love is never happy when someone is in trouble. That is what we understand the most important element to be: love, irrespective of what you have. Now, what are special gifts? Paul talks about the gift of tongues. Well, this is one of the most controversial topics you ever get in our modern world. For this reason, the one who speaks in a tongue should pray that they may interpret what they say. Well, you ask yourself, what really does the gift of tongues mean? In fact, it is a thought that I'm still considering to have a full episode on this. But in the interim, let us have this discussion. You see, Paul concludes by reminding believers that every gift ultimately serves one mission. Then he climaxes his emphasis on the gift of tongues and its proper use and how it implies. You see, the gift of tongues is the ability to speak human or angelic languages unknown to the person. Now, when you say it this way, it appears that the gift of tongues in itself sometimes is ununderstandable, incomprehensible. Well, is that the case? When this language is unknown to the listener, it really needs interpretation. And that is something many people miss. Well, we always cajole ourselves by the statement that the one who speaks in tongues speaks in mysteries. But the word mysteries in that sense is actually to disclose the fact that there's one speaking in tongues, especially when speaking in a language that is unknown. Of course, it's mysterious. But then Paul explains that when this is done, the language unknown to the listener needs interpretation. Basically, Paul's desire was that all should speak in a tongue that has been interpreted. In fact, he wanted all statements to be made such that everyone who listened would also have the privilege to understand. Unless, of course, the speaker is speaking alone or by himself or in prayer. Of course, if you are speaking in French alone, it is not mysterious to another person listening. But if you are speaking in French to an audience who are English without any language mastery of French, there has to be an interpretation. In other ways, if you are praying alone in a French language, it is mysterious for anyone who hears that. And of course, it is not important for them because you are praying on your own accord. But Paul now clarifies that in reality, it is important that to everyone, the manifestation of the Spirit is given for the common good. So, it is quite clear that not everyone receives the same gifts. How do you understand this? Basically, the gift of tongues is to help us to prophesy. In other words, to teach. And that is what we saw during the pouring of the Holy Spirit in the upper room when Peter began to speak. And everyone gathered in Acts chapter 2 understood his speech in their own language. So Peter spoke in tongues, and the Spirit interpreted for everyone who was there in that day. And the Bible is clear that several nationalities were there in that very moment. Well, I know quietly you are reaping understanding into this, but I'll try and do an in depth discussion on this particular topic. Well, let's move on. The gift of prophecy is what really should be the desire of all. Now, this is not prophecy of telling future events. The root word of this prophecy is that which means to teach or to impart knowledge. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 14:3, but the one who prophesies speaks to the people for their strengthening, encouraging, and comfort. Paul clearly shares that we must not limit the gift of prophecy to predicting future events. And as I already said, the primary use of the gift of prophecy is for edification, exaltation, and consolation. In other words, to teach and edify. So Paul actually highlights this gift above all others because we tend to connect with others when we teach and share our faith. But in more important scenario, Paul also urges that it is to be used correctly so as not to create confusion. What is the correct use of the gift of prophecy? Well, we have seen this characteristic gift even in the remnant church. And that is clearly depicted in a special manifestation according to the book of Revelation. That is, to be able to know and understand the times in which we are, and by that, teach others to know where we are as well. Teach others to understand our faith. But the question is, how can we even recognize the true prophet? In other words, who can we say is really prophesying, right? Well, the good book gives us clues. Anyone who professes to be a good teacher or a prophet should announce future events, and if they are conditional, must come to pass. Well, if they are conditional, their realization should have fulfilled that condition, and if they are not, should surely come to pass. It's so fascinating to see the number of people who in this current age prophesy and it never comes to pass. Secondly, the message that the teacher or the prophet, so to speak, has must be in accordance with that of the earlier prophets. You can go through the whole of the good book and discover that no prophet had a contravening prophecy with another true prophet. It never happened. There was no time Moses contradicted the sayings of Aaron. There was no time Daniel contradicted the sayings of Isaiah. It never happened. Well, it gets more interesting. This prophet who says he's true should bear witness to the incarnation of Christ. Of course, that is the foundation of our faith. Then, more importantly, you ought to speak and do that which you speak. Anyone who professes to be a prophet should have a life that is in accordance with the biblical message he carries. Wow. Indeed, the gift of prophecy is very significant. But more importantly, we have to understand that returning to the deck of the Titanic one, you'd realize that the orchestra never survived the night, unfortunately. Yet, history remembers them because, in the midst of fear and chaos, they refused to become individuals competing for attention. They remain one. So, Paul's vision for the church reaches even higher. It is important for us to understand that God has not called his people to perform spiritual solos. No, he has composed a divine symphony. Some will preach, some will teach, some will heal, some will encourage, some will give, some will lead, some will quietly serve where almost no one notices. But every note matters because the beauty of heaven is never found in one instrument. It is actually found when every gift, every life, and every heart submits to the same conductor, Christ. And that prepares Paul for his next and greatest revelation. I believe you are ready. But let me ask you, do you have a spiritual gift? Do you know? And how are you using it? More importantly, is it out of love?